I'm Nicole Shanahan, Bobby Kennedy's running mate. Welcome to Back to the People podcast, which highlights the growth of a movement uniting America, where our government is free from corporate capture and where we give voice back to the American public.
The Smith-Mundt Act is a piece of legislation that was passed in the late 1940s that allowed the federal government to broadcast their messaging around the world. There was this limitation on the ability for the federal government to take these materials and broadcasting those within the United States. In 2013, Congress repealed this domestic dissemination ban. So if you repeal the ban, and there aren't restrictions, I should say, you compromise the free and independent press. The government, which has potentially limitless resources, can come in and start dictating what people are thinking and doing by virtue of saturating the media market with U.S. state media, not unlike what it did during World War I and World War II.
How many of these are there still in existence today?
It's $1 billion a year media empire, really, that the federal government has.
Historically, it was radio broadcasts, then it turned into TV. Is the USAGM cross-pollinating on social media now, too?
Oh, very much so. We discovered that Radio Free Europe was actually targeting Americans with its articles. Pretty clearly a illegal act. And that is something that is more akin to totalitarian regimes. Also, we see it on the other side, removing voices that contradict the wishes of the current administration. We had our suspicions, but we didn't really know the full extent that the federal government, through various agencies, was so pressuring social media outlets to censor certain viewpoints, including Bobby Kennedy's viewpoints.
It's still happening.
You censor people who you don't agree with, and you flood it with your own information. And if you do both at the same time, the First Amendment and the freedom of speech in this country doesn't stand a chance.
It's very clear the power of journalism to dictate, public sentiment. And when that becomes something that is manipulated, there's a real risk of people falling prey to being used for an ulterior motive. Both
Republicans and Democrats are looking at this as a potential resource for whoever's in charge. And it's going to take someone who's nonpartisan or a true centrist bipartisan to really reform this.
Or a true lover of the Constitution.
Yes.
And a true lover of democracy. Democracy over party. Hi, Weston. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Nicole, for having me. This is great.
So, Weston, you wrote a paper a few years ago called Unmasking Uncle Sam, all about the Smith-Mundt Act, and had a chance to read the paper. Really fascinating that you've taken this on. Tell me, how did you get interested in the Smith-Mundt Act? It seems like you really opened a can of worms with this one.
Yes, I did. The Smith-Mundt Act is, just as a basic primer on this, is a piece of legislation, federal legislation, that was passed in the late 1940s that established a peacetime state media broadcasting system that allowed the federal government to broadcast their messaging around the world. So the part of the Smith-Mundt Act, as it was passed in 1948, had, although there's some disagreement about it, there was this limitation on the ability for the federal government to take these materials that were intended for audiences abroad and broadcasting those within the United States, which I call domestic dissemination. So the original act has restrictions about how people could view the material that was being produced for broadcasting overseas. You're thinking radio, you're thinking text, mostly radio at this point in the 1940s and 1950s. And the issue became a bigger issue in the 60s and 70s when certain people were trying to challenge whether or not there was a domestic dissemination ban in the original legislation passed in 1948. And there was reinforcement of that particular ban in 1972 and 1985. But then in 2013, Congress repealed this domestic dissemination ban.
Mhm.
And I happened to be on vacation at the time, actually, and reading a news article
Yeah.
that was describing the repeal of the domestic dissemination ban in the Smith-Mundt Act. And I was very curious about this. I have a background in media. I was a Fulbright scholar. I studied Arabic newspapers in Morocco. I wrote my senior thesis at college about Moroccan tabloids. So this was sort of adjacent to research I'd done before. I thought it was a really interesting topic. And at that time, I was required to, as part of being on a Northwestern University Law Review, to come up with a note, which is a form of academic research, to write about. And this was going to be a massive undertaking, and I wanted to write about something that I was going to find personally interesting and that I thought would potentially also be interesting to non-lawyers.
Mhm.
So I immediately emailed the editor on my law journal saying, could I reserve this topic? He said, yes, I can't imagine anyone else is going to want to do this, but sure, go ahead. And then I wrote my first piece of research, which was called Apple Pie Propaganda, which is one of the most downloaded publications on the Northwestern University Law Review website, with something around 45,000 downloads, which may not sound like a lot, but for legal scholarship, that's a ton.
It's a lot.
And yeah, and after that, I formed a relationship with a Syracuse University professor, Jennifer Greigel, who actually cold called me when I was in private practice in Concord, New Hampshire. And she says, I'm really interested in your research. I'd really like to collaborate with you on this. She's a social media expert. And through that collaboration, we ended up doing research. We ended up being interviewed by the New York Times, which we can talk about a little bit. And then we really got into the nitty gritty, and we decided we really want to write a law review article about everything related to the Smith-Mundt Act and U.S. state media, and really just encapsulate what's going on here, because it is such a interesting, in my opinion, but difficult to penetrate topic for Americans.
And it seems fairly buried. You don't hear much about state-sponsored news, and in fact, we assume our press is an independent press typically, and so taking a look at an act that was established in the early 1900s, really, I mean, that's the origin of it. In the sense of, the seeds were really planted over 100 years ago, and now we're 7 decades into the Smith-Mundt Act. It's not something many people know about at all. Not even lawyers. It's not something we talk about in law school. It's not something we would come across at our first law firm job, or even partners will spend time working on constitutional free speech issues, and you'll likely never come across the Smith-Mundt Act. Is that correct? I've actually never met a lawyer who knows much about it.
And neither really have I. The reason for that is, I think, in large part because there was this domestic dissemination ban that prohibited the federal government from disseminating these materials within the United States between 1948 and 2013. So there was really no reason for anyone to be studying this, because it was just sort of an afterthought. I mean, this is international broadcasting. It's not something that's going to be affecting Americans here in the United States. Really, ever since the repeal of the domestic dissemination ban about 10 years ago, there has been a number of scandals. There's been a number of issues with the federal government, internal investigations, things of that nature, that are cause for concern for Americans, because Americans shouldn't, in my opinion, be subject to federal state media, which some people call propaganda, or people who are in favor of it will call public diplomacy. It's more akin to a totalitarian regime than a free and open democracy.
So let's unpack this idea of a government propaganda machine a little bit. Let's go back to the early 1900s. In your paper, you talk about President Wilson forming the Committee on Public Information, which was an executive order to coordinate state media efforts. Um, so during that, there was, an immediate need to tie this to the United States' military efforts. Give us some insight on how what that looked like then, and what do you think the impetus was, and how this became a focus of the executive office?
So during World War One, which was a cataclysmic event, and America was very much on the fence about whether it should be involved in World War One and the extent to which it ought to be involved in World War One. So the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, was an effort by the Wilson administration to convince Americans that the war was a good idea. And what they did is this committee really saturated the market with, you can call it propaganda, you can call it state media, you can call it public diplomacy, but just a bunch of federal information, posters, newspaper text, even art. I think they even did like blimps or balloons or something along those lines, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it was just an overwhelming effort by the federal government to generate support for the conflict. And there was a lot of controversy surrounding this at the time. Some people thought that the government was peddling false information. Others thought, too, that the federal government was saturating the market so much with government media that it was a backhanded attempt at censorship. So, fortunately, though, that major effort to convince Americans to support World War I ended at the conclusion of World War I, and those state media activities really died down after that, until World War II, where we have FDR creating the Office of War Information, which is this similarly massive domestic and now foreign propaganda effort, state media effort, to not only convince Americans to support the war effort, but also to go to overseas, and counteract Nazi propaganda and Axis propaganda. I mean, that's really what that was about. And that's actually where Voice of America comes from, which some of your listeners may know about, which is this original radio station that was founded by the federal government to counteract and undermine Nazi propaganda in Europe primarily.
So really, in many ways, it was a response to what was going on in Europe. So it wasn't unique to the United States. It was not something that was necessarily originated in the United States, but was more a response to what was going on overseas at the time.
I'm sure, European nations, like during World War I and certainly during World War II, were doing similar efforts to what was going on in the United States. But the modern origins, I would say, of U.S. state media really happen in World War I, like so many modern concepts, is that era. And then in World War II, it became even more intense. But then after World War II, there was this kind of die down, I should mention. And that's actually where the Smith-Mundt Act came to be, was this concern about now Russian propaganda, Soviet propaganda, and whether the American government, the federal government, would be able to counteract that overseas effectively. And that's actually why we have the Smith-Mundt Act in large part. It had multiple programs in the legislation, but that was the sort of the main thrust of it, was to counteract Soviet propaganda in Eastern Europe and elsewhere.
Was it something that was done in tandem with the escalation of the Cold War? Because there was quite a bit of information going back and forth and intelligence during the Cold War, trying to understand the development of nuclear capacity. Do you think that it had to do with a larger effort on intelligence, or do you think it was separate?
It's a little of both, I would think. It was certainly about Cold War counteracting Russian efforts, because that's what America was doing at the time. They were trying to do everything they could to win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And this was one component of it. So we actually have, though, two sort of sub-components of this, which is you have Voice of America, which is the flagship state media entity that's broadcasting all over the place, saying, hey, you should support American policies. This is why, what the communists are doing. This is inappropriate. And then you also have, in the early 1950s, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty that come to be. Mm-hmm. And this is a fascinating story because Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were actually covert CIA fronts to do much of the same work that Voice of America was doing, which was to provide pro-American messaging in certain parts of the world. Now, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, they focused mostly and continue to this day on Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I think at that point it was more focused on Eastern Europe and the Iron Curtain, the Soviet bloc countries. But they clearly, the CIA thought that this type of action of spreading pro-American messaging was crucial. Why they did it covertly is unclear to me. I think they thought that this was going to give them greater credibility because it seemed like an organic movement rather than something that was coming from the U.S. government. That's my best guess. But there was a huge controversy in the early 70s when people recognized that these radio outlets were actually a CIA-funded operation. And at that point, the CIA stopped funding all of those things. So it is really the state media enterprise that exists now as well. It is really a child of the Cold War. This is one of the relics of, the U.S. versus Soviet Union battle that existed for decades and decades at the latter half of the 20th century.
Let's unpack Radio Europe a little bit so that folks can understand what that really looks like. So this is a radio station in Europe for European public consumption. What does that look like in practice?
The origins of a lot of this state media is to provide information, and particularly the American perspective, in information-poor environments. So it's about providing an alternative viewpoint in areas that otherwise don't have this. So Radio Free Europe was, I think it was a network of radio stations that were broadcasting into the Soviet Union, trying to show members of that country that, America wasn't that bad and that the Soviet Union wasn't great. And that's just fundamentally what all the state media is about. It's actually enshrined in federal legislation that U.S. state media outlets like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe have to advance and promote American policies. So the way, though, that Radio Free Europe and Voice of America did it was quite different than what Soviet outlets were doing. So Soviet outlets, and a tradition exists to this day with state-funded media like Russia Today, that comes out of Russia, is that the Soviets were much more inclined to just peddle falsehoods. They're just like, they would just make stuff up and shoot that around the world. And it was almost always about how bad America was and how great they were. And the American perspective was to say, and the American strategy, I should say, was to provide truthful, accurate information to counteract the, what they called the big lie that was being promulgated by the Soviet Union. So this was information that was, although objectively true, and I think that exists to the states, fact-based reporting in media, but it's not necessarily comprehensive in the way you might expect it to be. So there's going to be some massaging of the margins to make it look like what's going on is more favorable to the United States and less favorable to its rivals.
How many of these are there still in existence today?
It's $1 billion a year media empire, really, that the federal government has. It has Voice of America, it has Office of Cuba Broadcasting, it has Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is one entity, Radio Free Asia, as well as the Middle East broadcasting networks. So there are also some other ones in there, but those are the primary outlets that the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is the supervisory federal agency, that's how that agency gets out information to all, people all over the world.
Is this all under the U.S. Department of State?
It used to be, but no longer. And that's a common misconception. This is a standalone, independent federal agency, but independent is not independent like we think of it. It just is a term of art. This is an agency where the chief executive officer, the CEO, is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It's all these entities under it are all 100% federally funded or very, very close to it. It's
Wow.
part of the executive branch, but it is not part of the State Department. The State Department, though, I should note, does have, because this is all complicated, because the federal government loves making things complicated, is that we have the Global Engagement Center, which is its own little entity that exists under the State Department. And that is I would call it and characterize it as a state media agency that is separate and apart from the U.S. Agency for Global Media, but is known for funding private actors who help disseminate pro-U.S. messaging.
That means every time there's a new president and a new cabinet, there's a new head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Is that correct?
It has been, there's been a lot of turmoil. That's what I would think. So what happened is, to give you a little context about this, before 2017, for like 20-ish years, the U.S. Agency for Global Media was known as the Broadcasting Board of Governors. And the Broadcasting Board of Governors was a part-time bipartisan board that oversaw all state media operations as like the U.S. Agency for Global Media. The problem is that this was a really ineffective organization. There was a lot of infighting, inefficiencies, and there were reports on this that say that this was just sort of a kind of a disaster. So what happened is that the Broadcasting Board of Governors requested for Congress to pass legislation that would allow them to have a CEO with a lot of power to manage the U.S. state media operations in this country. So in 2017, legislation passed that allowed the president, with the confirmation of Senate, to appoint a CEO that would basically fill in for this part-time bipartisan board. Legislation that kind of came to be during the Obama administration, and then Donald Trump took this over. And what this meant is that, in practical terms, that the president had much greater power over the direction and messaging of the USAGM than it had prior. So what Donald Trump does is he nominates this guy named Michael Pack, who is a conservative filmmaker with ties to Bannon. And Michael Pack, after a very long process, becomes the CEO of the USAGM in, I think, June of 2020. So in the middle of the pandemic. And after he's confirmed, the heads of Voice of America resigns, and then he fires basically everyone else. He just cleans house in this organization and appoints Trump loyalists in these different positions. And there are multiple investigations of this period that found that Mr. Pack was attempting to change this agency, which is supposed to be editorially independent under federal law, into something of a mouthpiece for the Trump administration. Now, as a consequence of that, Congress did pass legislation at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021 that made it so the CEO didn't have quite as much power, but the basic structure still remains. And one of the first things President Biden did when he took office in January of 2021 was to remove Michael Pack from office. And I think that speaks volumes about how important that the president and the executive branch now views this particular agency.
That's really interesting. Let's unpack the domestic dissemination ban and then the overturning of that ban in 2013. Let's maybe go to why it would be important for the freedom of press in the United States to have a ban like that.
First of all, the United States didn't want to compare itself to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union at the time was believed to be widely inundating its own people with propaganda, which I think has some truth to it. So that was another way for the U.S. during the Cold War to draw a firm distinction between the communists and the Soviet Union. The other reason for this domestic dissemination ban was because after World War II, there was a lot of propaganda fatigue. Americans had been inundated with propaganda about the war. I mean, you see all these posters, about victory gardens and Uncle Sam Wants You and all this stuff and all the Hollywood reels. It was just overwhelming, and there was just a distaste for propaganda at that point in time, as well as this sort of fundamental belief that the American people, as taxpayers, should not be funding the government to tell them what they should be thinking. It just seems somewhat un-American in the tradition of this country. So I think those are, major reasons as to why the domestic dissemination ban was passed and why it existed for as long as it did. There's also another reason for it, in my opinion, which is that if you allow the domestic dissemination ban in, it will compromise the free and independent press. So if you repeal the ban, and there aren't restrictions, I should say, you compromise the free and independent press, because what happens in that instance is that the government, which has potentially limitless resources, can come in and start dictating what people are thinking and doing by virtue of saturating the media market with U.S. state media, not unlike what it did during World War I and World War II. The other issue, which is more of an economic issue, which I should mention, is that private broadcasters and private media outlets, they didn't want the federal government competing with them. So even though there's a lot of collaboration historically between independent private media and the federal government, they still didn't want this big state broadcaster to be, drawing away ad revenue and viewership from like ABC, CBS, NBC. That's really why the domestic dissemination ban existed. It was a multi kind of consideration effort.
I think, before the ban, my understanding was that there was a lot of reliance on U.S. news outlets like ABC, CBS, and others to really augment the government broadcasting. So, around the time of the war, it was almost as if without the ban, there was such a blur between independent news broadcasters and government news broadcasts. I mean, they were really using the private broadcast networks as well, is my understanding. Is that true?
So you're saying that the federal government was employing private broadcasters to sort of get its message out?
There was active leveraging of the public broadcast networks to push forward some of the government-sponsored media. It would be hard for the average consumer during 1941 all the way through World War II, the conclusion of World War II, to differentiate between what is a government-sponsored media broadcast and what is an independent media broadcast.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, particularly during that period of World War II, where the distinction between public and private was essentially non-existent. The government really took over so much of American society during that time. But even post-World War II, there's a lot of collaboration that still goes on between, independent private media and the federal government and state media. And actually, I should probably say that there's a bit of a continuum here. So you have independent media, which you think of like New York Times, ABC, CBS, that kind of privately funded media. And then in the middle, you have what I call public media, which is going to be media that's partially, say, funded by the federal government. So NPR, PBS, often doing educational programming, things of that nature. And then to the other extreme is state media, which is going to be Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and these USAGM networks. What's weird, though, is that what we've been seeing is a lot of cross-pollination between those three groups. So, for example, the ex-CEO of the USAGM, John Lansing, was the CEO of National Public Radio for quite a while, up until late last year. We see that these state media folks are infiltrating other non-state media parts of the fourth estate, the independent press and the public media. This has been going on for a while, but the extent at which it's going on is a little troubling. Also, the current CEO of the USAGM, Amanda Bennett, has deep, deep ties to the Washington Post. So I think she's married to the former publisher of the Washington Post. And as a consequence, I think we see a good deal of favorable coverage coming out of the Washington Post for the USAGM and Bennett specifically.
Yeah, that does strike me as a possible conflicts of interest. And then, certainly having Trump completely refill that entire USAGM office and management and likely policy and direction of use of the agency had massive impacts as well. It seems like the USAGM also leverages whatever media platform is most used during that time in history. So historically, it was radio broadcasts, then it turned into TV broadcasts, and now we're in this age of social media and TikTok. Is the USAGM cross-pollinating on social media now too?
Oh, very much so. Yes. So back in 2018, my collaborator, Professor Jennifer Greigel from Syracuse, and I were writing about state media, and we discovered in our research that through an ads database on Facebook that I don't think exists anymore, that we discovered that Radio Free Europe was actually targeting Americans with its articles, which is not allowed under federal law. So the state media agencies like Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, they can make their materials available, but they're not supposed to be targeting Americans with their messaging. So this was pretty clearly a illegal act. And through that, we contacted the New York Times, and the New York Times published an article in July of 2018 that reported on this kind of a bombshell issue of that the federal government, contrary to federal law, was targeting Americans with state media. And they, in that article, a spokesperson for was then the Broadcasting Board of Governors, but they said this is not appropriate. The head of Radio Free Europe stepped down a couple months later. There was a subsequent internal investigation in December 2018 by the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he found even more violations of the Smith-Mundt Act and this prohibition on targeting Americans, because this is contained in the Smith-Mundt Act, this prohibition on targeting Americans. And he found not only that Radio Free Europe was at fault, but also the Voice of America had been targeting people in Persian language. And in Washington, D.C., there were 860 violations plus that was documented in this report. I mean, it's bad news. I mean, there was an estimate from an earlier investigation that said that over 500,000 Americans were exposed to state media messaging. So through social media, it's their go-to now. These outlets, they have websites, but social media is, I think, where they think the battle is being fought and won between the United States and its rivals in Russia and Iran and others in China, because that's where so many people get their news now, and that's where so many people are tuned into. So this is, I think, where they devote a lot of resources and time to figuring out how can we get our message across on not only Facebook, but Twitter and YouTube.
Yeah, we saw some of that after the last few elections. What do you think's happening right now in this election? How do you think the USAGM is being focused?
That's a good question, and it's kind of hard to know because a lot of this stuff just evades detection. I can't speak to things that may be happening that are targeting Americans that might be covert because I just don't have that information. But I will say that as far as, if you check voanews.com, which is the Voice of America website, or Radio Free Europe website, you're going to find that the coverage they have is very pro-American and also, I would say, pro-Biden and anti-Trump. Like today, I saw an article covering Trump's criminal trial on Voice of America, and I'm not sure that that's coincidental. I'm not sure how relevant that is necessarily to the entire world, but I think it's certainly relevant for the upcoming election. So again, there's supposed to be some degree of editorial independence between the federal government, who's in the White House, and the state media networks, but I think there's definitely leakage there.
And wasn't there supposed to be increased government transparency that coincided with lifting the ban on domestic dissemination? It doesn't seem like there's much transparency if we can't trace, what pieces of information are being financed either directly or indirectly from the US AGM.
Yes, you're right about that. I think the transparency, though, was really focusing on, can researchers like me and others access Voice of America programming and Radio Free Europe programming. And that was just for study and other purposes to see where your tax dollars were being spent, right? But this other stuff, which is kind of not maybe covert, may not be covert, that is definitely not transparent. And that is something that is more akin to totalitarian regimes. This idea of, targeting Americans with social media ads, but also what we see with these U.S. state media outlets is not being totally transparent about what they are. Mm-hmm. So like VOA's website, it's a government-funded and I would argue controlled entity, and it's .com. It's voanews.com. It's not voanews.gov. And in my opinion, it should be. This is a government outlet. Same for Radio Free Europe. It's rferl.org, not rferl.gov. And it ought to be, because that's being transparent about what you're actually doing. Because under federal law, these outlets are required to advance U.S. policies, which is something that is not required of independent media outlets. So the fact that they are trying to disguise themselves as independent media outlets to enhance their credibility in the eyes of their listeners and their readers is, I just think, dishonest. And they have a very strong belief, these agencies, that if they were to disclose the fact that they are financed by the federal government and advocate for the federal government, they would lose massive credibility. But I think that actually that's wrong. I think that people will figure out that these outlets are, in fact, financed and advocate for the federal government. And when they figure that out after reading these materials for potentially years, they're going to be pretty ticked off. I mean, it's deceptive. So in that sense, U.S. state media has never been terribly transparent. And if they were to attribute their materials better and have more forthright disclosures about what they're doing, I don't think that's an issue, because people will still come to those outlets for the American perspective.
It does seem really misguided that hiding the state-funded media somehow increases trust in that media. I mean, look at where we are right now. More than 50% of Americans say they don't trust what they see on the news. To your point, it seems like it would be in the best interest of the federal government to label what is being paid for and the source of this information, especially in an age in which we're consuming so much of the news on social media platforms, and the source of where this stuff comes from oftentimes becomes very important for people to understand its validity. Where do you think we're going with this next? It seems like it would be so much more beneficial to the federal government if there was some kind of watermark that could travel, or like a hash that could travel with state-created media.
And actually, in 2005, members of Congress would have agreed with you, because in 2005, there was a piece of legislation called the Truth in Broadcasting Act that came forward and was discussed at length in the Senate and the House. And what it was a piece of legislation that would have labeled government publications clearly so that people knew what they were consuming. And the reason why this legislation it failed, by the way, but the reason why it came to be and was drafted and discussed was because around the 2003 Iraq War under the Bush administration, there was an effort by the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, to put forth unattributed programming called video news releases and distribute those to independent media outlets who would re-air them because they were provided for free and there was no requirement that those be disclosed. So there were things being aired on news stations around the Iraq conflict that were coming from the government, but people didn't necessarily know that they were coming from the government. And so this attribution requirement that came to Congress was, I believe, a really good idea, but it just didn't have the support. And I think it's also easier said than done. Like, how do you actually implement this? Because the government is talking to us all the time, and it would seem like it would have to be very tailored and very specific in order for it to function. But the concept is there. But we can certainly start with properly attributing these U.S. state media outlets like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, because why not? It would just require a pretty minimal amount of effort to change the domain name, for example, or to, have another disclosure, pretty prominently displayed on the website. And I think that would foster trust with its viewership.
Yeah, there's a lot of trust that's been lost as a result of not knowing what we're seeing online. And if we did know that this was something created by the government, it would give us a chance likely to interface with this information better and also to form opinions on big issues. I mean, look at what's going on right now today with Ukraine. It's such a divisive issue in our country, whether or not we should be sending further billions of dollars of support. Now we're looking at a 10-year security agreement with Ukraine. It would be great to know what pieces of information about what's going on with, for example, negotiation and peace talks. It's almost impossible to find clear information today on where those talks are and what the key issues are for Russia.
You're right. I will say that Voice of America and Radio Free Europe are going to be good resources for figuring out about the Ukrainian conflict, what's going on here, because they're going to provide the American perspective and the American idea as to what is happening and to what should be happening.
But Weston, which America? America is so divided.
Oh, true. I think what I'm saying is that and good point. It's the America of the Biden administration. It's what the Biden administration is looking for. They're not necessarily going to be covering probably as much as they ought to the discussion that's going on in this country regarding whether or not we should be funding Ukraine in their fight against Russia. I will say, too, if you want the Russian perspective, like Putin's perspective, you can always visit Russia Today, which is their state media outlet, RT, and they will provide sort of their 2 cents about what's going on in Ukraine. I don't think it's necessarily reliable. It's very sensationalized media, but at least if you look at it, you can get the Russian perspective. Again, I'm not advocating for trusting what they're saying, but it's just having both sides can be helpful, and then figuring out sort of where the truth is probably somewhere in the middle and probably closer to, what's going on and, on the American side of things. Because again, the Russians historically, and I'd say to this day, have a tendency to fabricate things.
It seems like we might be getting a good representation still from Voice of America. And we might be able to understand at least sentiment coming from Russia Today. And if we take the two, mix them together, and try to look at it cross-sectionally, we might be able to understand in reality what's happening.
Yeah, it's not unlike, if you really want to kind of figure out what's going on in this country, you can take a look at what the left is saying, what the right is saying, and it's probably somewhere in the middle.
In the center. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's where Bobby Kennedy is.
Yeah.
Let's also talk about social media a little bit more. There's this big TikTok ban that just got passed with quite a bit of bipartisan support. Um, and the concern with that was that TikTok being owned by largely Chinese funds has this potential of somehow being infiltrated by the CCP and thus used to influence American sentiment. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is something that's a little outside of my research. So I'll be speaking in broader terms. The threat of foreign influence in this country it's definitely a problem. We have China, we have Russia. Those are the two primary actors in this, but there's others too who are trying to influence how Americans perceive certain things. And I think it's normal and rational for Americans to be concerned about these rivals on the world stage coming in and trying to shape American public discourse. The question is, how do you fight that? Or even if you do fight it on a federal level, do you trust the independent press to do their job and to out these outlets and to fact check and do their, what they're supposed to be doing, which is to create a robust and free and largely truthful public discourse? The problem is, though, is that in this digital age, a lot of these independent media outlets are facing a lot of crises right now, both internally and externally, because of funding and because of shifting from, more traditional forms of media to, more electronic forms of media with the advent of the internet. So it's a question as to whether they're up for the task. But in an ideal world, I don't think that these influences that are coming from abroad, like China, like Russia, would necessarily require a large-scale U.S. response by trying to have the American government come in and say, no, this is the truth, this is the truth, because that could really compromise free public discourse pretty rapidly, because now we have the federal government telling us what to do on all sorts of different matters. And, that's what I think about when I think about, dictatorships.
It's very clear the power of journalism to dictate, public sentiment, elections, the direction of wars, involvement in wars, people's sense of identity, people's sense of threat. I mean, it controls so much of the psychology of a nation. And when that becomes something that is manipulated as just a matter of shoring up power, there's a real risk of people falling prey to being used for an ulterior motive, which is I think why we as a nation have worked so hard to prevent totalitarian regimes to be successful in this country. We understand the importance of freedom from being manipulated for someone else's axis of power. And we've always applauded the individual's ability to think for themselves, to fend for themselves, to provide for themselves. It's such a foundation of who we are as a nation.
That's incredibly well said. I think oftentimes, we're not only seeing, the U.S. government trying to insert themselves into discourse actively, through these state media outlets and the repeal of the domestic dissemination ban a decade ago. But also we see it on the other side, which is to censor topics that they are not happy are being, distributed on social media networks. I mean, we see that with the Murphy v. Missouri case that's on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which, the plaintiffs in that case, the original plaintiffs, are arguing that, the federal government violated their First Amendment rights indirectly by pressuring social media platforms to remove some of their speech from, Facebook and other of these outlets, which is kind of now the modern public square. So that's sort of the other side of the coin too, is, my research historically has been about the U.S. government going out and trying to convince people through their own messaging what they should be thinking. And this is happening abroad for the most part up until a decade ago. And now the U.S. government is potentially doing some of that here, although it's more limited, thank goodness, and hopefully will remain that way. But there's also this other thing of removing voices that contradict the wishes of the current administration. And that is concerning because those are really the two ways that you would destroy free public discourse is you either or both is what you do is you censor people who you don't agree with and you flood it with your own information. And if you do both at the same time, the First Amendment and the freedom of speech in this country doesn't stand a chance.
No, it doesn't. And it's so important to preserving our democracy. Do you think that there's a piece of legislation that could be drafted today that would provide more transparency? Do you think Congress would be open to seeing something like that today, given what we know now and how this agency has been used over the past 3+ terms?
Yes, there's ways both from the Congress, passing federal legislation, as well as through the judicial branch through the development of, First Amendment law, common law. I'll focus on the legislation. We've already touched on one, which is the attribution of U.S. state media in various contexts, I think would be helpful. There's also an argument that the federal government can't be trusted and that we should reinstate the domestic dissemination ban and put some teeth on it. So that way the federal government cannot get away with this stuff and there are serious repercussions if they do try to target Americans with messaging. That's another way to do it. There's sort of a milder approach where in 1990, Congress passed this legislation that said, well, the domestic dissemination ban stands. However, material that's over 12 years old can be accessed by Americans because that's deemed to be free of its ability to propagandize people, which kind of makes sense. Like if you're talking about something that happened 12 years ago, probably not relevant to the current day.
Yeah.
So maybe a modification of that where materials that were produced 2 years ago, 5 years ago, that might be a good compromise so that researchers can access these materials, but still the American public is protected. There's also, just practical things that we've also touched on, just having these agencies internally have it, label themselves better and having agents, that are appointed or the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media really changing the culture there to be more transparent about what they actually are. But Nicole, I think where this falls right now is on the shoulders of the American people and also the social media platforms. Like YouTube does a pretty decent job about labeling Voice of America state-funded media. And they also label other, Russia Today, they label state-funded media. But Twitter, although they did it for a hot minute, they don't really do that right now. And that's concerning. And Facebook has had struggles with this too. But if these social media platforms started to label these all state media, not just foreign state media, which they've been guilty of labeling foreign state media, but not U.S. state media as state-funded, if they did it across the board, I think it would really benefit the American people and allow for greater transparency and better free public discourse in this country.
And there's a difference between the review for targeted ads versus domestic dissemination, right? There's actually a really important difference between those two, correct?
Yes. So it's the difference between making it available and putting it in your face. So the domestic dissemination is sort of saying, look, we have all this material. If you come to us, either through our website or at the agency itself, although who does that, but you could go to them and say, hey, I want to look at this stuff. And you're requesting it in that instance. And there's actually a restriction in the law. That's what I call the upon request restriction that really kind of encapsulates this concept where you can, upon request, access these U.S. state media materials within this country. But as far as targeting, I don't think really anyone certainly up until 2013, was thinking that the federal government should be able to target Americans with state media. That was taboo and not something that was considered to be a good thing. It was considered to be a Soviet tactic. And I think there's still a strong coalition of people that think that is still the case and should be the case.
Mm-hmm.
But the actions and the words of the federal government are two different things. And my concern is that, if people aren't keeping a real close eye on what the federal government's doing, that there is going to be a lot of attempts by the federal government to target Americans with state media under the, to support this idea of counteracting foreign state media.
Especially, it seems, during an election year, because that seems like it should absolutely be illegal, that you could use taxpayer dollars through the U.S. AGM to support a candidate of your party or the policies of a party just because you happen to be in office. I mean, shouldn't that strikes me as something that shouldn't be allowed to persist. I mean, and any conflicts of interest related to the leadership of the USGM should certainly also be checked and screened for.
Yes, the USAGM, when faced with this potential criticism or flaw in how they do things, they claim that they have this thing called a firewall.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple parts of federal law that require that the USAGM, adhere to journalistic standards and that they cannot have interference from the Secretary of State and others in government.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, so that's like the statutory level, and then also at the rule-based level, i.e. within that organization, they also have something similar, a firewall rule. So they will claim that they are not subject to the whims of whoever is in the White House. But what we saw during the Trump administration and when Michael Pack was in charge of the USAGM was how quickly that can break down and how quickly it can be that the White House actually has really incredible sway over the state media empire in this country. And I just want to mention, too, that this is not like some sort of, the U.S. state media is massive. According to their self-reported figures, they have 450 million weekly viewers of state media worldwide. And their most recent budget request was for just shy of $1 billion. They have thousands of employees. They are on par in many ways with CNN or MSNBC as far as resources. But unlike, private cable news or, similar media outlets, they can, through the federal government, they can get a lot of funding very quickly if so wills it.
But they can increase their budget throughout the year?
Year over year.
Year over year. Okay.
Congress can, because they're funded annually.
Mm-hmm.
So they have an annual budget request, and usually Congress will meet or exceed that request in practice. So the USAGM in total is $1 billion a year agency, which isn't a lot in the scheme of the federal government, but is still a lot in the media space.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 10 years, they've become much more effective and coordinated and organized than they were before the domestic dissemination ban was repealed.
Let's talk about remedies. Are there any remedies the American public has when the U.S. AGM breaches any of these federal rules restricting targeting?
So that's an uncertain question at this point. There's nothing that I've found in the legislation that would allow for what's called like a citizen suit, that would allow an individual to sue the federal government if the USAGM or one of its outlets were to violate federal law. There are, though, cases that are coming forward more on the censorship side of things,
Mm-hmm.
but that are challenging the federal government's ability to shape and manipulate free public discourse in this country. So we have what was called Missouri v. Biden, now it's called Murphy v. Missouri, that's being currently decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. We also have another case that I believe is still at the trial level, which is the Daily Wire versus, among other parties, the Global Engagement Center, which I mentioned before as being a state media entity that funds private entities to distribute U.S. state media. And how these two cases, and there's going to be probably more, how these come down is going to, I think, really shape, at least in the short term, what rights, if any, Americans have to challenge the federal government when it oversteps its boundaries and violates the Smith-Mundt Act and other parts of the law that touch on U.S. state media. So it's an uncertain question. I will say that now there is not a lot ordinary Americans can do, and the federal government, when there have been violations, hasn't really done a whole lot to discipline or otherwise discourage these agencies from doing similar misconduct. It's just there's not a lot of teeth to the current legal setup for disciplining these entities when they violate federal law.
Could Congress somehow reduce the budget down to a number that would require it to engage in certain internal reforms? What are the powers of Congress? If say we don't have many judicial powers, it sounds like, as citizens, what kind of powers could Congress have to check and balance the Smith-Mundt Act?
Well, Congress is in the driver's seat. They implemented the domestic dissemination ban. They created, this whole U.S. state media empire. They could just as easily, dismantle the U.S. state media empire, or they could reimpose the domestic dissemination ban. They could require attribution. They could completely defund the U.S. AGM if they so desired. These are things well within their power. My concern, though, is that this is a bipartisan issue in a bad way, because I think that both Republicans and Democrats are looking at this U.S. AGM network with the removal of the domestic dissemination ban as a potential resource for whoever's in charge.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we saw that with the Trump administration. I think we're seeing that to a certain extent with the Biden administration. So the odds of Congress defunding this or implementing meaningful reforms to this agency to protect Americans from undue government influence, I don't think they're terribly high at the moment. And it's going to take someone who's nonpartisan or a true centrist bipartisan to really reform this.
Yeah, or a true lover of the Constitution.
Yes.
And a true lover of democracy. Democracy over party. I think it's a real need. And I think I think the American public wants it. I don't know any American who wouldn't want to know if they were specifically targeted for state-funded media. It's, to me, to think that I'm somehow being manipulated every time I access the web, which we all are to some extent, whether it be corporations selling marketing, or mostly corporations selling products, but we are being manipulated in some ways, or influencers selling their influence in exchange for access to other personal marketing channels for themselves. But most of that you can see through. My concern is that some of the state-funded media is evolving in a very sophisticated way, and it's hard to understand what the motivation is. Whether it be a motivation of a political party or whether it be a motivation to go into war. But it strikes me that given where we are in social media, that it would be very, very dangerous to let this go unchecked, and that Congress is probably the best situated to curb that right now.
I would say Congress is, yes, but the U.S. Supreme Court could as well. They could put down, some true legal common law doctrines that would limit how these federal agencies can communicate with the American public without violating the American public's First Amendment rights.
Could you get to that through a censorship case, though? I don't think so. It would have to be through something related to targeted dissemination or targeted ads.
I hear your point. This is a very rapidly developing area of the law. I don't think really anyone knows quite where this is going. Um, the case that's on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court involves censorship. It involves whether the government was violating those parties' First Amendment rights by virtue of pressuring social media platforms to censor them. And it would be, I think, a landmark decision either way. And there might be some language in that decision, even if it is a little, wishy-washy, that, other cases could build upon. But one thing I really want to point out for you, Nicole, that I think speaks to the question, I think speaks to why U.S. state media is particularly nefarious, is because the U.S. Supreme Court has said, government speech, which U.S. state media, I would argue, is, there's a whole doctrine about it. It's called the government speech doctrine. The government can speak freely. It doesn't have to, weigh both sides when it is talking about a particular issue. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said that if people don't like what the government is saying, they go to the ballot box and they elect different people who are going to change what the government is communicating. But the problem with U.S. state media and some of the censorship stuff that's going on too is that the American people are unaware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, only through a chance encounter with the Facebook ad archive did, Jennifer Greigel and myself discover that there was this, bad stuff going on from the federal government targeting Americans with social media ads. And in this Murphy case, according to, the original plaintiffs, that they were saying that, hey, the only reason we know about this is through litigation discovery, that they were doing all of this stuff. We had our suspicions, but we didn't really know the full extent that the federal government, through various agencies, was so pressuring social media outlets to remove and censor certain viewpoints, including Bobby Kennedy's viewpoints on occasion.
It's still happening.
It's a mess.
Yeah.
It's a mess.
Can you submit a FOA request for all of the spend, like where all of the budget has gone?
So the USAGM is I think relatively transparent about on a broad scale in their budgetary requests about where money goes.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the nitty gritty as to how much they're spending on social media advertising, et cetera, I'm not sure how much value that would provide to me as a researcher, because a lot of that may be directed overseas, which would be fine because they can target, people in Europe and Asia and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
On our experience, we have tried to FOIA the USAGM on various things in the past that was related to our research, and we just get back a stack of papers that are just blacked out.
Wow.
They're redacted because, they are just invoking all of these exceptions to the Freedom of Information Act. And as a consequence, it kind of ended up being a dead end.
So it comes back redacted. That's not very helpful.
No.
You wonder why we have the Freedom of Information Act if what we get back is all blacked out.
Yeah, I think some of the exceptions to FOIA requests are a bit overbroad, and I hadn't really appreciated that until I was engaging with it myself.
I mean, first of all, thank you for doing this work. You stumbling upon these things and digging deeper, I think is really a synchronicity with the spirit of democracy, because we need people doing that. Our country and our nation needs that. And so I'm very grateful to you for doing it, and would love to stay in touch.
Yes, same. And thank you so much for helping to get the word out. It's just such an important topic that so few Americans know about. And it's just really important that we keep an eye on what the federal government is doing in this area, because if we don't, we really risk compromising free public discourse in a very serious way.
We will. And you are. And thank you so much.